Nearly 26%, or 61 million U.S. adults, live with a disability today. According to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, yet persistent disparities in both education, employment, and health outcomes continue to shape their everyday experiences. At the same time, nearly half of all organizations and American people believe at 44%, according to the National Institute of Health. Organizations routinely perform better when they welcome, encourage, and respect, and include all people of all backgrounds, particularly individuals with disabilities, with a particular emphasis in emphasizing the importance of disability inclusion. In this episode, I had the opportunity to sit down with my friend Jennifer Chassman Browne, an educator, a former school administrator, and curriculum designer. She's also a passionate diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate, and she also has the lived experience of living with rheumatoid arthritis since the age of 6. She draws on a lifetime of lived experience and educating others, particularly young people. She draws on a tremendous amount of insights when it comes to strengths, resilience, and the unique perspectives which individuals with disabilities can bring to communities in all facets of life. She also explores the critical role that allies, intentional structures, and inclusive systems can play in creating environments where everyone has an equal opportunity to thrive. She's also a certified listener poet, and she brings a deep human approach to her work using storytelling and the power of poetry to foster empathy, connection, and a true sense of belonging. This conversation is intended to challenge assumptions, highlight systemic gaps, and ultimately reframes the concept of disability not as a limitation, but a vital part of human diversity, which enriches us all. And Chassman Browne joined me this week to tell me more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Jennifer, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm super excited to talk to you all about your career in education, my friend. It's great to see you, and thanks so very much for being here on this Wednesday, my friend.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Now, Jennifer, I know that you've got more than 2 decades in education and diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I'm curious, from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, how would you qualify or how would you define the current state of American education, my friend?
I think it's in a difficult spot right now. So for me, like I was teaching and working as a school leader for about 20 years and realized that like there's no sense in trying to talk to kids about caring about their English or doing their math homework if they are not being supported just to feel safe in the school. And I don't mean like safe from violence. I mean just like their identity is seen and valued and they feel like they belong. And I think that since I actually started consulting, it's gotten harder. It's gotten harder for teachers to be able to do that. They have so many students with so many diverse needs who are in their classes day to day. And, um, the resources that they had, the support that they had, the financial backing, the programs that existed are all kind of under threat right now. So I think it's just very difficult for teachers currently.
Yeah, absolutely. And specifically for students with disabilities. Now, I was born with cerebral palsy, and it's been about 20 years since I've been in school. But I know that particularly for parents and teachers who are helping to sort of shepherd students with disabilities through the educational process, it's becoming more cumbersome to making sure that they get a quality education. So I'm curious, from your perspective, for students with disabilities, where do you think the future of that is going, and what would be your message to parents trying to get their kids through school if they have a disability, my friend?
Yeah, there's a lot that you just asked. The
Yeah.
first thing that comes to mind for me is just the idea that when you're talking about students with disabilities, you're talking about such a broad range, right? So I was a person with a physical disability, a mobility disability, and so that impacted my education very differently than say a person with a learning disability or a person who's neurodiverse. Like part of it again is the expectation that teachers somehow know how to serve students with that broad range of needs, right? So I needed something that was very different than the student sitting next to me than the student sitting next to them. And I think it's about schools committing to educating their teachers, right? As a teacher, I don't necessarily need to have training on how to serve every single student with every single disability or need related to that disability. I just need to have an understanding broadly of what it means to serve a student. How do I partner with that student? How do I partner with their family? And so I think when it comes to the question of like, what can parents do? Advocate, 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 right? So, like, I think teachers generally want, and this is my experience as a teacher, both my experience as a school administrator, teachers want to meet their kids' needs, right? They care about the students in their classrooms. They want to help them be successful. And often, as I said, they don't know exactly what it takes to do that. So, I think parents, without being there every single day, can still set up meetings with their teachers, talk to the school administrators, always empower their kid to ask for what they need. But working with the teachers directly to say, hey, this is what my child's challenge is, and this is what they might need in terms of accommodations, and I'll support you, the teacher, in providing those, and but I like they need to be provided, right? So there are the systems in place within schools and within districts to provide that, but I'll tell you there's a reality to like the um, squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Like if somebody
Mm-hmm.
is talking to the teachers and asserting their students' needs, and again, especially the student can also express what they need, they're more likely to see that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jennifer, how do you think the new definition of, or the modern definition of inclusion in education should be written? How do you think the word inclusion has evolved in education today, my friend?
Yeah, I think about the idea of like the least restrictive environment. And I think that's where kind of inclusion came from. And I think it's still connected to that. The idea that I want to be in the spaces where I am capable of being successful, even with some structures, supports, and accommodations. Like you want to have everybody feel like they're included. And I think inclusion is not just about students with disabilities, it's about everybody, right? Inclusion crosses race and gender and sexual orientation and ethnicity. So I think it's also about disability, about like the idea that I think it comes down to value, frankly, right? That like my presence is valued. Um, and so then systems are going to be set up, and they don't need to be like fancy systems, but just things are going to be in place so that I feel like I can participate to the greatest degree that I'm capable.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Jennifer, I know for you, you've lived most of your adult life with rheumatoid arthritis. In fact, you've lived with it since childhood, and you've spent most of your career, as you mentioned, as an English teacher, and you're still connected to the people that you taught back then, and you have experience as a school administrator as well. So I'm curious if we can dive into your personal journey living with a disability and how it shaped your life and your work, my friend.
Yeah. I think I'll sort of start at the end and then go back to the beginning and then go back to the end if that's all right. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
so I think, you know, you asked about inclusion, but I also think that belonging is really the thing that we want to aim for. And that's really about the individual sense of feeling like they're in the right place and that that's a welcoming place. Um, and so I was diagnosed at 6 years old with rheumatoid arthritis. I spent a lot of time in my childhood hiding it. It wasn't super visible, but the times when I felt like it was, for example, standing up from my desk in elementary school if my knees were really stiff, I would do things like rummage around in my backpack so that it looked like I was just rummaging around in my backpack. But really, what was happening was I was taking a minute to straighten my legs, to stretch my legs because they were really stiff and sore. And so I was hiding it that way. I had to wear braces at night. I had to go to the doctor every Saturday for medication and such. And I didn't tell classmates about that. That was something that, like, my family knew, and I never discussed it with anybody else. So I was doing a lot of hiding when I was young. And I got to a point in adulthood where just the natural aging of my body on top of the arthritis made it visible. I have like visible joint damage in my hands, and I walk on my toes and sort of stiff legged. So once it became visible as an adult, it was like starting a different life. And I say that because suddenly the attention that's paid to me was paid to my challenged body and not to the things that I was doing, like as a teacher or a leader, where I would get up and present in front of hundreds of people. Suddenly it was like, oh, what's wrong with you? Right? Questions like that, comments like that, people constantly offering help, even if I didn't want it. So, my journey's been challenging, and I think that that has really brought me to a place, though, of like my disability as a child was very different than my disability as an adult in the way that it manifested and in the way that it drew attention to me. So my move to do disability consulting specifically is a lot about my experiences as an adult and realizing that a lot of people have had these experiences their whole life, and that I really want to do whatever I can to create a world where, like, people with disabilities are people and seen first as those individuals who contribute, who, you know, we're all different, right? We all have something that makes us different. And I don't think that's, you know, I think that's the case with people with disabilities as well. So the idea of like, you know, it's a little bit of like healing the things that I've had to deal with, healing the ways that I've had to reevaluate my sense of self by working with people, non disabled people, so that they understand how their behavior is impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, as an advocate for this space, I know it's important to you that what we advocate for are demonstrating that people with disabilities can bring gifts to society and can be competitive allies to society. So I'm curious when you talk to people about, getting rid of the label or dispelling the myth that what people with disabilities can and cannot do. I'm curious about your approach to helping them think beyond the label. What do you? How does that guide or influence the work you do as an advocate in this space today?
Yeah, thank you for that question because I think it's integral, right? I think it's the whole purpose for me in doing this work. And that's, while I am focused now on disability education and advocacy, even when I was doing, more broad DEI work, the idea is dispelling myths. The idea is seeing commonalities, right? Or seeing differences and not seeing differences as valued, right? Like, because I'm different than you doesn't mean that I'm better or worse than you, right? It doesn't mean that I'm at the core, I'm still a person with the same kinds of experiences as other people. And actually, so as it got harder to do this work because people were pushing back against it and doubting the value of it, the thing that really stood out to me was storytelling. When I would be doing any kind of a training session or a workshop, I could be saying things that were more sort of informative or instructional, and people might agree or disagree or want to reject something or feel their defenses come up if something felt challenging to them. But when a person in the room, including me, told the story of their life or some part of their life or just even an incident or an experience, people were compelled and captivated. And it was a different sense of like being able to learn from each other. And that has actually motivated me to do a book. I have a book that'll be out in October called See Us, Know Us Profiles of Disability that tells the story of 30 different people, a diverse group of people with disabilities, and just gives the reader a sense of like what their life is like, how it's so similar to yours, what their struggles have been, so that you can have an understanding of that and an empathy for that. And also just what our commonalities are. Like there's so much that's really common across groups of people, from people with disabilities to able-bodied people, like that we can connect on, that we can find similarities. And I think that's really the way out of the the lack of care, the lack of supports, the poor treatment of people with disabilities. Is if people really understood us and what our lives are like, heard our stories, I think that there would be a different desire to make sure that the world was accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, I'm sure this won't surprise you, but I wanted your thoughts on this because our friends over at PBS they did a study or a report last year that found that many general education teachers, by as much as 30%, they don't feel as if they're equipped to meet the needs of people, or students rather, with disabilities. The report says that only 30% of teachers feel confident that they can read to and meet or exceed the needs of students with disabilities. So I'm curious, with your background as both a school teacher and an administrator, I'm curious, how do you think we can support teachers to close that gap so that they can feel more confident in supporting students with disabilities?
Right. I think back to my own teaching, and I don't recall that there was a class about supporting students with disabilities when I was earning my teaching credential. There may have been a chapter in a book, right? So a couple class days that we talked about it, but not in any real detail that would have made me feel equipped to do it. And then I think that when you get into the classroom as a classroom teacher, even when you're talking about accommodations, there are like five that I can think of that teachers are kind of encouraged to do, right? So give a student a quieter environment to do their work, give them extra time on something, have someone be a reader or a note taker for them. There's very little in terms of the scope of supports that are provided for students with disabilities and that teachers know about, right? So I think it's critical to have part of teacher education be how to serve students with disabilities. And as I said before, you can't, there's so many different kinds of disabilities and so many different needs that students have. You can't cover everything. But I think if you give teachers an understanding of some of the range of supports and accommodations that could exist, that do exist, that they could implement, and then you say, and anything that you think of that you can, arrange with that student's family to do that feels like it's still, equitable, I suppose. Not giving that student sort of an unfair advantage,
Hmm.
but recognizing that they need a support and you can provide that support and they're still showing you that they're learning the material and that they're completing the work. I think being creative, showing teachers kind of how to step into those creative spaces and find ways to support students, but I don't even think it's talked about. So I would say, Kevin, the first thing is it has to be part of the conversation in teacher education programs. It has to be part of the conversation in schools where you're doing professional development.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this because I have advocated for a long time about providing students with disabilities, equal access to employment opportunities because, as you know, students with disabilities don't often get like the necessary internship placement that can lead to a sustainable employment after college or during their transition out of the age of majority. So I'm curious to ask you about how do we work with both the education and employment sector to improve, the employment prospects for students with disabilities and alter the attitudinal barriers of employers to understand that hiring or employing people with disabilities isn't a charity but a competitive advantage. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, thank you. I think you come at it from a whole bunch of different angles, right? So with a person who might be finishing their education or a training program, high school or college, who wants to go into the workforce and who is a person with a disability, there ought to be programs that they can access that help them navigate the application process, right? So I think a lot of it is how you present yourself, seeing the ways that you can contribute, the ways that you can pitch yourself, position yourself that may not be things that initially come to mind, right? Seeing the fact that you've had to be a creative problem solver day to day in your own life is something worth sharing with potential employers, right? You have a skill set that a lot of other people might not have. And I think that people with disabilities don't often see that, like, oh, that's an asset that I want to share, right? That I want to make sure I highlight in the process. So I think you're coming at it from that way with people with disabilities. Any school should have programs for students who are finishing their education or moving into the workforce, to prepare to help students with disabilities prepare for the process. But then I think the flip side is the employers. So I did a keynote a while back when I talked about the value of hiring people with disabilities. There's real data that shows that we tend to stay in jobs longer than
Hmm.
people who are non-disabled.
Yeah.
Um, we bring, as I said, creative problem solving approaches. we create a culture that is a healthier culture because we're different than some of the other people in the workplace. So there's this different sense of diversity. There's this different sense of understanding each other and working across differences. Um, Having people with disabilities in the workplace opens the door to all sorts of other inclusion and belonging. And by that I mean when people with disabilities are advocating for and asking for spaces that are accommodating for them, that makes other people who might have other needs feel like they can do that as well. So I've talked a lot to employers about what is the value of hiring people with disabilities. But then the last thing I think is even talking through the application process with employers. There's so much that still exists that's antiquated and that creates artificial barriers, not only for people with disabilities, for everyone. And I think the thing that comes to mind initially is like, you've seen a job description that says you must be able to lift 50 pounds,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I, like, even when I wasn't compromised by my arthritis, and even many of my colleagues who have no disabilities can't lift a 50-pound box. Maybe they can lift it from the floor to the table, but they can't walk across the room with it. So I just feel like talking to employers about what is your application process? Are your job descriptions really describing what you need? Is a particular degree really necessary? Could you have somebody who shows you that they have the skills to do the job, even if they've not taken a traditional educational path, which I think is true for some people with disabilities who didn't have access, right? So, like, somebody could still be very capable of doing the job, very qualified to do the job without having exactly the degree or the certification that an employer's asking for. So, I push on those kinds of things as well. And then the last piece that I would say is then when you get the person with a disability into your organization, like when you have gone through this process and found a great person and you've hired them,
Mm-hmm.
please continue to support them. So I think that's true for all employees, right? Especially employees who are members of marginalized groups. Like, develop employee groups so that you employee resource groups so that people feel like they have community within your organization and they feel like they belong.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Jen, I want to talk to you about black students with disabilities and also black students in general, because last year, the University of Alabama, Birmingham, released a study that said racial and ethnic minorities, particularly black children, are underrepresented in terms of, evaluating risk factors when we're talking about special education and education in general. So, how do you think we can close the gap to serve black students, particularly understanding the racial and cultural barriers that may exist for them to get a quality education? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
I again go back to educating the teachers and educating the school leaders. So, those black students who are in schools, the likelihood that they have a white female teacher is something like 80%, right? Or 80% of their teachers will likely be white female teachers. So many of those white female teachers are not um, culturally aware, right? There's realities to people's experiences that they're different than yours, and that it's so important to um, understand. You don't have to understand everything, but understand something about the culture of the students who are in your class. And I think there's also a reality to um, I don't know that I want to say the criminalization of black students, but the idea that two students can exhibit the same behavior. If one of those students is black, they will be punished maybe when the other student is not, or they will be punished more harshly than the white student is for the same behavior. So I think there's a reality to that teachers need to understand, that teachers need to work against. And so when you have a student who is a student of color, a black student who also has a disability, I think often that student is seen as like, if they're struggling, it's viewed as defiance or being a troublemaker, right? Rather than a student who really genuinely is struggling, because there's a racial bias or a racial judgment that's occurring at the same time. And the teachers aren't necessarily aware of that. They've not had education that would allow them to understand that or see things through that particular lens. So you ask like what to do. I mean, I feel like Kevin, I keep coming back to education, education, education for the teachers.
Hmm.
I was able to be a part of an ethnic studies program, or in a district that had an ethnic studies program for students and had teachers teaching ethnic studies, and I was able to be in spaces with them and get a better understanding of how that built inclusion, how that changed the way that teachers saw their students and interacted with their students, and also empowered the students to really take ownership of their own education and feel confident in speaking up about what they needed. So I just keep going back to like, educating the school communities, the adults in the school community.
Yeah,
I actually had, and I actually
yep.
had a student, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I had a student who I was trying to get to go to advisory, and I used to have to sort of have this slow chase with her around the building, trying to get her to go to advisory. And one day, instead of following her around the building, I saw her in the cafeteria and I said, "What would it take for me to get you to go to advisory?" And she said, "Put me in," and she named the teacher's advisory, "Put me in her advisory." And I said, "That's it? That's all I need to do? And then you'll go to advisory?" And she said, "Yeah, I like her and I trust her." So I made that change for this student. And I went back to her and I said, "What did you ask?" And she said, "I used to ask. Nobody ever said yes. So I've stopped asking for what I need." And that was like, I felt this, oh my gosh, right? Like, this student, and maybe many students like her, don't feel empowered in the space to even ask for what they need because they've heard no so many times, which is unfortunate, right? So I have like a disposition to yes. If there's no reason really for me to say no, let me figure out how to say yes. But it also was so impactful for me that she just said, "Why would I ask when nobody's ever said yes to me?"
Mm.
And
That
that was
that
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 was a
that.
student of color as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly empowering for sure. And then I'm also curious because a couple of months ago, a parent of a 1-year-old with a disability reached out to me. He wanted me to give him sort of an action plan for advocacy for their kid. And he had 3 other kids, and he was a director of marketing, and he lived a busy life. But he said, all I want from my kid with a disability is to feel included in a mainstream classroom. And what are your best advice in terms of advocacy and working with the school community and other resources? And I said, start advocating for him when he's out of the womb, and
Yeah.
even when he's still in there. But I'm curious, when we talk about integrating students with disabilities into a mainstream classroom, what sort of questions do you think parents should ask themselves, and ultimately ask their administrator to make sure that their kid with a disability has a full and equal chance to be integrated into a mainstream classroom? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
I think it's a partnership. So I think it's not about what, like, walking into a school and saying, "What are you going to do to make sure that my student is included?" I think it's about, like, I would even like step into that space with, of course my student is going to be included to the greatest degree that they're capable. How are we going to do that together? Right? I can tell you what he or she needs, and I can, you know, be creative in discussions with you to figure out how to provide it. like it's a foregone conclusion. Of course, your child is going to be integrated and included into whatever classroom they're capable of being in, and you're going to teach the administrator and teach the teacher and learn from them about what the ways are that you can best include that child, right? I think it's important, like if you start that way, it's going to be much easier for that child to continue to be included, and they call it mainstreamed, which is also a weird word.
Mm.
But like they'll be included in the typical or traditional classroom because you will have been doing that from the time that they could crawl into daycare, right? Like or into preschool, and they were there, and sometimes it's the teacher who's going to discover the greatest way to work with the child, and sometimes it's a parent who's going to bring in the idea. But I think it's if you approach it as this is what we expect, and we're going to partner with you to make sure that it happens. Like you said, start that inclusion plan from the day the child is born or in the womb, right? Think about even when that child is young and at home before they start school, what are the things that you're putting into place to make sure that they are successful even in the things that you do at home?
Yeah, and Jennifer, I know that most of your leadership experience comes from designing curriculum as an educational leader. You've also served as an assistant principal, and I'm curious to ask you how those leadership roles have made you a better diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate, and how do you think your work has continued to hopefully improve the quality of our educational system? What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I think it's at the core of what I do and why I do it. So when I think about that, like being a teacher obviously was an education in itself. I learned how to be better each year and to serve all kinds of students. And I think in some ways being an administrator taught me the same thing about the adults that I was working with. Um, they're bringing a lot to their work as well. Most of them are really committed to doing the best that they can for their kids. So it's about helping them to feel equipped and empowered as well. Um, Teachers sometimes are big kids with more developed egos than the students, and so it's really about also helping the teachers to feel like they're being supported. That what I want for them, I would say to them, like, I want nothing more for you than for you to knock it out of the park every day. Like every day, I want you to go into your classroom and it's a home run. I'm not here when I work with teachers, like, I'm not here to make them feel bad or to scrutinize. Even when I'm giving critical feedback, even when I'm coming into their classroom and observing, what I want ultimately is the same thing I want for the kids. I want the kids to be super successful, and I want this teacher to be successful with all of their students and in the work they do. So I think that's really at the core of what I do is I want this to work for everybody who's involved. Teachers work really hard. They don't always have everything they need, and so equipping them and then supporting them so that they can do really well is at the core of it.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about your nonprofit in a second, but I also wanted to ask you about giving yourself grace as a parent who raises kids with a disability, or an administrator or a teacher responsible for, you know, educating that segment of our population. And for my parents, they always looked for partnerships to make sure that I could have the best shot of at an inclusive life as I could. And I'm curious to ask you about the importance of making sure parents don't burn out and how they can support themselves when raising kids with a disability, because it can get overwhelming for parents and educators alike. So what's your best piece of advice for giving yourself grace as a parent or an educator in that context, my friend?
Yeah, always grace. Um, Always recognizing that what you're doing is difficult, and when you're doing your best, that's the best you can do, and to just give yourself grace. And the progress is not going to be linear, right? So some days are going to be rough and other days are going to be great. The thing that popped into my mind initially, though, when you asked this question, is simply community. So, so when my disability became visible and I was suddenly sort of outwardly defined by it, that was a lot for me. That was a very big shift for me in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would be in a very different place than I am now if I had not reached out to other people with disabilities to, and it's not like we always talk about disability. We just spend time with each other, and it's just good to be normal and happy and silly and having a good time in community with other people with disabilities, because there are things that you don't even need to talk about that they just understand. And I think the same is absolutely true for parents of kids with disabilities. Find someone who has that in common as well. Find an organization to be a part of. And like I said, it doesn't need to just be around the disability issue. Just be friends with those people. Have them be part of your community. Invite them over for a, picnic or cookout or whatever. Um, and just be in the space with them, because even without talking about it, they'll understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, I know you recently founded a nonprofit that focuses on, the education and advocacy around disability, including more than just a T-shirt company, which promotes disability positive messaging, my friend, and you donate the proceeds to disability organizations that are looking to positively promote disability inclusion. So tell me about the t-shirt company and why you decided to start it, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. So More Than a T-Shirt Co. Came about because when people were making comments to me about my body, just strangers in public, I always felt minimized. I always, even if I thought about what I would say in response to people, I always felt caught off guard in that moment and didn't know what to say to them. Um, and so the t-shirt company came out of like, if I could get people to stop thinking about people with disabilities as like needing help or um, needing to be prayed for, or having something wrong with them, or being damaged, and recognize that those people with disabilities are full, whole human beings with lives, doing wonderful things. They're athletes, they're business people. Um, that maybe people would stop making some of those comments to people with disabilities when they see them out in the world. Um, so I created a few designs with actually a former student who's an artist to encourage people to think about people with disabilities differently. So there's like a runner with a prosthetic who's a marathon runner. There's a wheelchair user who it says like, I am a, business owner, lawyer, doctor, teacher, recognizing that that wheelchair user, you know, is likely to be, employed and doing work and have their own life and their career. There's one about anxiety, like what anxiety feels like. So I've just created these designs as a way to get people thinking about, oh, that person has a disability, but oh wait, they're um, engaged in the world the same way that I am. And then uh, I have given a lot of the proceeds to the Arthritis Foundation and Autism Speaks, but I also have run some promotional um, sales, and I'll do this for anybody who wants to buy a shirt, and that is donate the proceeds to any organization of their choice that's a disability nonprofit. So
Yeah,
I've had,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I've had a few people reach out and say, "Hey, I'm affiliated with this organization that, or the Spina Bifida Foundation, or something like that. Will you donate the proceeds from my shirt to them?" So I'm happy to do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know most or some of your workshops over the last couple of years have I mean, focus on things like implicit bias and how to get racism out of a disability inclusion and all the rest. So I'm curious about your approach to providing a diverse workshop and how you hope the attendees come out with a better understanding of what disability inclusion should actually be about. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that I approach the workshops um, really wanting people to understand what they come with. How do I say that? So, like, if they have perceptions that maybe they're not even aware of, or they have biases that are subconscious, to be able to talk about those in spaces where there's not shame, right? I'm not trying to get people to feel bad about themselves and then to sort of pull inward and not want to explore something. I'm trying to get people to be willing to say, huh, like when you said that, this is what I imagined, and that seems kind of biased to me. Or you said a person in a wheelchair, and I thought of a homeless person on the street, right? And then to examine that kind of perception, to think about where did that come from, and how can you make note of seeing people who are wheelchair users who are in jobs and athletes and putting yourself in spaces where that's true and it changes your perception of people who are different than you are. So it's really about people examining their own internal workings, like what's happening in their brains, what's happening in their hearts, and figuring out how to get them to see the world differently than they had before. And I sometimes use the analogy of like living in a fishbowl. And when you're living in a fishbowl, you're so accustomed to it that you don't even realize that there are other fishbowls out there where people are living differently. You're so surrounded by your own water that continues to give you reinforcing ideas about what life is like in your own water. That when you get into a different environment and you realize that things are different for other people and they could be different for you, you're willing to see things in new ways and question your own, challenge your own viewpoints. And I think that's really what the trainings that I do are about.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jen, I've got two questions left for you, and I'm going to combine them because I think they're
Okay.
interconnected. And I'm curious for anyone watching or listening to this who isn't, immersed in the disability community and wants to be an ally or better practically understand sort of what people with disabilities go through. What do you think would be your practical takeaway about actionable steps that they can engage in to be an ally to the community? And then just lastly, when you look at your life's work and your own personal and professional legacy, how do you want your legacy to be defined?
Yeah. So to the first question, I would say learn. Learn, learn, learn. There is absolutely no reason that a non-disabled person can't join a disability organization,
Mm-hmm.
can't be connected to disabled communities, right? So like the more that you are in spaces with people with disabilities, the more that you'll see their diversity and their richness, the more that you read. There are great books out there. If you even just Googled like disability education books, there's so many that are great that will help people see disability in different ways. Um, so I would say learn and then act. So when you are a non disabled person, you can be an ally by stepping up and being vocal about inclusion, being vocal about belonging, being vocal about calling out something that you see that doesn't sit right with you. Even just being like, instead of saying, hey, do you need help with that to a person with a disability, say, hey, how are you doing today? Right? Like, don't just see them as someone who needs help, see them as a person that you say hello to in the same way. I was doing a presentation once and I had a nursing student say to me, like, if offering help to a person with a disability is something that I should be sensitive about, and I described people offering me help like constantly throughout the day, even when I don't need help, or refusing to take my answer when I said I don't need help. He said to me, "Well, how do I offer help to a person with a disability?" And I said, "The same way you do to a non-disabled person." And I remember this student who was a nursing student go, "Oh, well, of course that's the answer to the question." Right? I just ask it like, "Hey, are you good there? Have you got that?"
Hmm.
Right? Do you want any help, instead of do you need help, or stumbling over yourself to offer help? Right? So like, just relax and be the way that you would be with anyone with us. Um, so that's what I would say to that situation of like, what can I do? Just learn, be an ally, practice ways to interact with us that are the same ways that you interact with anyone. Um, and then my legacy, I don't know, maybe what I've just described today is my legacy. Like, I just want people to be thoughtful about their interactions with people with disabilities, and maybe even more than that, to know that we are very similar, right? Like, I'm very similar to so many non-disabled people who have the same kinds of life experiences and hobbies and interests and hopes and dreams and relationships and joys and challenges. Like, recognize that we're similar. um, that's really what the book has been about, is to tell these stories, not to make people feel like people with disabilities are inspiring, but just to make them feel like they can make connections with us, the broad us, right? That we're very similar in so many ways, and then there's an importance to making sure that the world includes us and that we can belong the same way anyone else can belong. And then the other thing I would say, can I swear, Kevin? Is it okay for me to say
Yeah,
that?
of course. Yeah.
My motto recently has just been that I just want to bring good shit into the world.
Mhm.
So when I think about what I'm doing, I'm like, is this bringing good shit into the world? If I'm writing, or if I'm, leading groups or doing webinars, like, I just want to be sharing things that are positive.
Mhm. Absolutely. And my friend, tell me finally, if people want to get connected with you, what's the best way they can do that?
My email is jachassman@gmail.com. My consulting company is newground.us, New Ground Educational Consulting. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook. Yeah, I have a Facebook author page, Jennifer Chassman Browne author. All kinds of ways. Like, if you Google me, you'll find one or five of those different ways to reach me.
Well, fabulous. Well, my friend, as someone that does similar work to you, and as someone who wants inclusion to be sort of a pillar of acceptance rather than a pillar of having to explain all the time, I think you're doing great work in closing the gap in inclusion and acceptance, my friend. I really admire the work that you're doing, and it was a real privilege to engage in conversation with you this afternoon. And I want to thank you so very much for being here, my friend.
Right back at you, Kevin. So I am so appreciative of this opportunity. I'm so appreciative of the work that you do and the voices that you amplify. We're all on the same team, trying to move in the same direction, I think.
Well, as long as we row in the same boat and bring a couple along the way, that's the goal, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.